Can you talk to me about the way that you created this idea and this feeling of isolation through the cinematography? And I think it makes the most sense to start kind of at the end of that scene in this kitchen, which you've alluded to a few times. This is the first moment where we realize she is a lonely person. Despite all the success, like you said, she doesn't have anybody to share it with. And you have to make a pretty dramatic change in the tone at that moment. After a big, long scene of showing action, 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 now everything kind of comes to a stop and it has to feel real and natural and authentic. Tell me how you went about making that moment feel so isolated.
Yeah, I think it was about just finding compositions in those spaces that help to convey that isolation. So I think, John Carlos, our production designer, just built these magnificent sets. Her kitchen was a set, that bedroom was a set, and they were beautiful. And I think it was just like, Lucia and I would use Artemis on our phones, and when we had downtime from shooting another scene, we'd walk over into one of the sets, that was under construction, and I'd try to find an angle that could maybe work for when Deborah was in her bed, alone at night, just before she turns off the lights and lowers the electronic curtains. And, we'd text those back and forth and just sort of see like what felt right. And it was really about those compositions. I knew it's also in that contrast though. It's like, you're totally right. In the beginning, she's surrounded by people and the camera's moving with a ton of momentum and energy. And she's sort of in the center of frame and all these other people are surrounding her on the periphery and she's guiding us. And I think what that allows you to do is when you have all of that movement, once you cut to her house and she's alone in the kitchen or alone in the bedroom and the movement stops, subconsciously, you really feel that and you feel that change. And it means it works on you on emotional level. At the same time, we also felt like those shots in the kitchen, they should move a little bit, but just very differently. Instead of Deborah sort of driving the action like she does in the beginning, where we're following her and she's dictating the camera movement, she's sort of static and we're sort of pulling back just very slowly. And I think that's just like sort of works to help in that isolation. You sort of see that there's actually, these spaces are bigger. She's actually even more alone. There's even more dead space in these compositions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's interesting too, because all of these scenes are packed with set design. Like there is not a blank wall anywhere. Everything is full, but it still feels very empty. And I'm curious if there is something in the lighting or in the cinematography or framing that is giving us this feeling of isolation, even though she is still within a very full room.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think like in the kitchen and in the bedroom, I think like I wanted to play with this idea that she was coming home late at night after a very hard day's work, not only performing but traveling around the country doing these QVC things, and that she was coming home and it was just sort of, I wanted this like kind of midnight feel to it, where the house would sort of it wouldn't be like fully lights on. It would sort of be like a dimmer sort of vibe, just to sort of convey that time of day. And then, so the environments are sort of naturally awash in shadow. And then, but we're doing these wide compositions. So we really wanted to draw your eye to the character. So in all of those wide frames, Deborah's sort of sitting under like a soft pool of light, sort of not top down, kind of backlit to sort of pull her off of the space. But I think that you're right, Bennett. That really does sort of lend to the isolation feel of the whole thing. Like she's in these huge spaces, and she's really just spotted out from them. I don't know. Is that sort of what you felt?
Yeah, I think that, when I'm watching it, because we've talked about creating isolation before on this show, and usually it does come down to framing. It comes down to isolating them within light. But I think there's also something about like almost the pacing. There's something about creating isolation in the pacing, where in the beginning in that oneer, there's so much energy to it. And even though she's the center of the frame, she's driving everything, she very well can still feel isolated throughout those scenes. When we hit her alone in the kitchen, there's a calmness and a pace to the camera motion that I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's like making you focus on her more or noticing the camera motion more, but there's something in that pacing. And I was curious if I'm just looking too far into it, or do you feel that camera motion plays a part in this isolation?
No, I certainly do. I think that slow pullout like tells sort of the whole story. Like she's static
Yeah.
alone in this big wide frame, and we're pulling out and revealing this empty space. I think that's totally right. And I think it's like we said, it's the contrast. I think like sometimes when I have a tough time cracking how to like naturalistically convey the emotions of one scene, I often will look at scenes that precede it and see if there are things that we're doing there that we could contrast that could impact the scene in question. And I think that I think that those, it's very subtle. Like we're getting into the weeds on like these isolating frames. It's very subtle what we're doing. It's a wide isolating frame with a little bit of the pullout. I think it only works because the stuff that precedes it has so much energy that you feel us pumping the brakes. And if we weren't using those techniques on the earlier scenes, I'm not sure that these isolating frames would have that emotional impact.